Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are around the world. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for what I anticipate to be a great topic that will get people thinking and probably enjoy some lively conversation in the Q&A as we get through today's presentation. So, just for the sake of trying to keep things seamless and moving forward, I'll try to keep everybody muted and monitor the chat. As well as after the presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A with Calvin, or if anybody has any questions regarding Purdue Innovates, I'll be here to help answer those as well. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening for everybody. My name is Doug Applegate. I'm the Associate Director for the Purdue Innovates Incubator, and pleased to host today's Lunch and Learn topic and speaker and presenter today regarding software development lifecycle. And whether you're leading a single development team of one or multiple dev teams in your startup or for your software-based business, today's conversation should help highlight some opportunities and some learnings about how to pinpoint areas of improvement, how you might be able to boost your team's velocity and accelerate your software development lifecycle, and maybe even a few tips and tricks to make sure that you avoid or to be mindful of in this journey. So with me today, I have esteemed guest and Purdue alumnus, Calvin Hendryx-Parker, who is the co-founder and CTO of 6 Feet Up, which is 6 Feet Up is a Python and AI consulting company that makes the world a better place by using technology to accelerate the initiatives of companies that do good. Calvin's massive transformative purpose, or MTP, is to inspire and enable tech leaders to open minds and bring the world together for a sustainable future. He is passionate about the open source community and specializes in app development, AI, big data, and cloud technologies. Calvin is one of only 48 AWS heroes in North America. That's pretty rarefied air. He is the founder and host of the Python Web Conference, the co-founder of meetup group Indie Pie, and the founder of Indie AWS. So with that, all those accolades certainly says that there's somebody with a presence of authority in the room. So with that, Calvin, I want to obviously open the floor to you. I will stop sharing my screen and allow you to get your slides set up, but wanted to welcome you and to the group, and hopefully give everybody a chance to learn a bit more about you and your firm and what what today's topic really holds.
Awesome. Yeah, excited to be here. I was really excited when Doug approached me to come fill in a last-minute slot at the Purdue Innovates Lunch and Learn. Always happy to step in and help the Boilermakers in times of need. It's fun. I'm a third-generation Purdue graduate, and my son is now a sophomore at Purdue as well. So we'll have hopefully a fourth-generation Purdue grad on the way too. So I'm excited about that. And then I get really, really passionate about software development lifecycle discussions. I know it sounds really geeky, but hopefully I will impress upon you the importance of this subject as we talk about it today during this Lunch and Learn. It will be interactive, so there are some points in here early on where I'm going to pull up a Slido. We'll do a couple polls and a couple feedback bits that'll help guide the conversation. And then also feel free to use that same Slido to throw questions, or you can throw them in the chat here, and I think Doug will probably be watching for those and can pick those up. But either way, it's fine. I'll be watching the Slido on the side over here as well, and then we will kick this all off. So let's get started. We actually move the window of all the people over to one side and my stuff in the front. Cool. All right. Like I said, thanks again, Doug, for having me. I really appreciate being able to benefit the greater Purdue community and the world at wide on doing a better, how to be better at software development. As I mentioned earlier, I get really geeky about it. But really, nowadays, the world runs on software. We all care deeply about software because most organizations are running some kind of software, either that they've built or pieced together from SaaS products, or they've got some bit of software that really powers what's going on behind the scenes and under the covers. What is maybe disconcerting is that some of the stats around software projects and IT software projects being at risk is that 75% of businesses and IT executives anticipate that their software projects will fail. This came from World Metrics, and I'll have links to the slides so you can actually pick those up. And the failure rate of IT projects is like 43% right now, and 2/3 of those software projects fail due to cost overruns and delays. So in my mind, and we kind of alluded to this, if we want to impact the world, we want to be as productive as possible about how we approach software development and the software processes. And so as Doug mentioned, 6UP is a premier Python and AI agency based in the US, but we specialize in solving these hard kind of problems. Our group probably has more experience per capita than any other agency that's out there. We really take a lot of the wisdom of all the years of all the people who've been involved in this and try and distill it down into solutions for other people. But we also try to share our practices like this with other groups, for example, how we can make better software developers out of the rest of the world. Our team has 25 years of experience across 12 or more industries, and we also specialize in a hybrid project management approach. So when talking about this thing, there's no one single specific project management tool or approach we use. We kind of pride ourselves on being very agile in the agile project management space. Okay, so as far as the slides, there is a QR code here that will take you to a GitHub. If you just go to 6UP's GitHub, you can find the 2024 Purdue Innovates slides there. These were plain text, but if you want to pick those up for later reference, that's the place to get it. I will bring this back up later in the presentation in case you miss it, but if you wanted to have a copy of the slides, they are up on GitHub and actually get built with a CI pipeline up there, trying to prove that we practice what we preach and use all of our best practices all the time. So let's get kicked off though with our very first interactive here. I'm going to bring up a Slido URL. So if you actually go to slido.com and you put in the code Purdue Innovates with no space, or if you just scan that QR code, you can use your phone, you can go to your web browser. Either way is fine. We're going to do 3 quick activities where I want to try and understand something about the teams who are in the room. So that's what we're going to do right now. So if you go to slido.com and put in Purdue Innovates, we will get kicked off with our very first poll right here, which is inside of an existing team, or inside of your existing organization where you're at now. How many development teams are in your organization? So I want a little bit of feedback here so we know like the size of the organizations we're dealing with, how many people have multiple software teams working in concert to produce software for your IT organization, so we can understand better who we're talking to. So we've got like one right now with so 86%, 88%. We've got one software team. We've got a few people who have between 5 and 10 teams. So it's interesting. We're kind of on 2 sides of the coin here. We've got very big and very small represented. Oh, there we go. A few more popping in now. Some more representation. It's interesting because I think no one group is going to have typically a very large software team. So I'm assuming most of those solo teams are pretty small orgs with small teams that they're managing their software process with. Okay, let's keep moving here. And so what I want to understand is, so given that context of like thinking about your software development teams that are inside your organization, let's talk about how happy you may be with the velocity that team is providing. Let me get the next survey up here. And if you don't get a chance to participate in the last one, you can participate in the next one. So when thinking about those teams and the software that they're delivering on a daily basis, how happy would you say you are with that software delivery? From kind of 1 stars being, it's not great, to 5 stars, it's outstanding. I couldn't imagine it being any better. Why are we even sitting here talking about software development lifecycle? They've obviously got this mastered. And so if we think about that, how happy are you with that velocity? Is there room for improvement? Are you ecstatic with the team? I see we're kind of landing right in the middle. It's kind of what I expected. I think there's always room for improvement in every team. If anybody said there was a 5, I'd want to talk to you and probably hire your team to come work for our team because you're probably doing such an incredible job. So that makes sense. I think that is aligned with my expectations were for this group as I came into today's Lunch and Learn. So what I want to do next is we're going to talk about a story of a journey of software development lifecycle. So this has been a journey over many, many years where we were approached by a prospect who, before they even wanted to do any projects with us, asked us, how can we be more like you? They saw the way we operated, the level at which the team was effective in producing software and the velocity of the code and the releases and things that were going on. And they wanted to really dig deeper in on that and understand like why their team was operating at different levels than our teams. And actually they wanted to understand even internally, this is a group that has over 30 different subsidiaries. So this is probably on the more large side of software development teams, but they're very small teams, or actually I guess they were kind of varying in size teams from 2-people teams to 30-people teams. The understanding how each of those teams were behaving and seeing if they could actually become a higher performing software development team. So we actually asked them to give us a subset of teams that might be open to the idea of interviewing and talking to people about what makes them tick and what their current software processes look like, and trying to identify if there were gaps in the process or see if any kind of common themes or things like rose to the top as part of this. So we talked to 6 of those 30 teams, and some of them were poorly performing, and actually some of them were actually doing quite well. But the goal overall was to improve delivery velocity. We had some assumptions about what we thought might be going on inside the organization, but we wanted to be able to validate them. I think every manager or director of software teams probably has a hunch of what's going on under the covers with their current software teams, but they don't have a lot of data necessarily to back it up. So we went on a journey to try and find that data and understand what those assumptions or what those root causes may be. So the next exercise we're going to do, so this is, again, we're going back into some audience participation. I want to understand from you all is, and you can type this just in the poll on your Slido now, is what do you think some of the common causes of poorly performing teams are? Like, what are your initial thoughts on maybe lack of velocity? Why are the teams performing at the level that they currently are? Is there some burnout's a good one. Interesting. A common one I've seen also is a tech debt. So if someone wanted to add that one in there, I'm sure that's a very common one we've seen. And I think you can even upvote. So if you also agree with any of these, you can upvote those words on there to bring them maybe more to the forefront. Ooh, scope issues. That's also a good one. Language skills of the team. So it sounds like we've got some teams that are potentially offshore, nearshore, and dealing with maybe language barriers. These are good. It's really good, actually. We're going to all get along really nicely because I think this is hopefully you'll get a lot out of this, because what I'm seeing here aligns again very much with where we saw some of these teams performing. Inadequate, or I'm amazed there were even time estimates given. Sometimes we work in areas where you may not even see that. Specialism silos. Awesome. Very good. Cool. I think we got most folks have given some feedback onto this. So let's dive a little deeper on some of the root causes that we've seen as we did this interview. As we went through this process, again, we had a goal of understanding and uncovering maybe where those gaps are, where you have expectations and the teams aren't meeting them. And what we ended up doing, though, is, of these 6 teams, we probably, out of the 30 teams, we interviewed 6 of those teams, and we used a sampling of people. We couldn't reach everyone because it was a very hands-on process to start with. We actually looked at, how we could actually structure a set of interview questions to each of these teams to try and uncover what these actual issues were. And we had, obviously, just as those same engineering managers and directors had hunches and kind of gut feels for what might be wrong. What was actually kind of incredible was how many other things we actually uncovered along the way as part of that process. It's just interesting that some of the root causes can come down to things like legacy workflows or unclear requirements, things doing lots of manual interventions, lots of humans in the loop when pieces could really be optimized or automated. And I mentioned earlier, like tech debt, for example, is a big one. Building overly complex and outdated code bases, handling and dealing with that, it makes it slow to onboard new users into the software development mix for your teams. And for example, teams may lack necessary skills, the ability to adopt new frameworks, new tools, new methodology. Poor communication was actually one of the items that came up on that word cloud we just did. So I think that confirms, like with what you all are thinking as well, is these kinds of issues do exist. And let's look specifically down at one of the issues, or one of the teams in the group here. We had one team that had many issues. And so as we asked all these questions, we tried to come up with a structure, an underlying framework for how we thought about software development lifecycle and how we could measure when a team is actually accelerating and doing great at a specific area versus if they were poor at specific areas. And so we looked at these teams and kind of started inventorying the various issues we saw. But really what it came down to was we looked at 4 stages that we consider vital to the software development lifecycle evolution, and based on that, defining like 19 different units, over 90 different data points. And so you can imagine, as we did these interviews, these took quite a while to go through. We probably spent about 3 hours with each team, so it's times 6 teams, and then we still had to basically go back and analyze that data that we had done the interviews for. So in our methodology here, each of these stages, we try to have them build upon one another. So if you're looking at the current stages of like build, execute, streamline, and transform, the build phase is kind of the table stakes. If your team isn't sitting well in some of those build, like first stage skills, then you really shouldn't even be looking past that, because there's core foundational issues that probably need to be addressed before we even get into how do we start innovating and moving the real needle on the execute, streamline, transform area. So it's interesting, as you go down through these various stages, it's not just, are they good at coding? Are they using source control? Are there security practices? It goes deeper than that. So for example, in stage 1, the very first box in build is issue identification and resolution. I think a lot of folks in the software development world may be thinking of issue identification as like issues or defects in the software code itself, but more fundamentally or foundationally to a team, you need to be able to surface process issues that are inside the team so that people can make the world and the work that they do better as they go, and document it and have a process that is followed by all as part of the software development lifecycle. So the software development lifecycle isn't just the code that gets laid down and the software that's delivered, it's actually the culture that goes around all of that. So for example, development environment setup has been a big part of my push to make it so that onboarding a new developer should be as easy as in the first day they get their laptop, they should be up and running and be able to start pushing code within that first day that they've joined your organization. And we commonly found in some of these other orgs that we were talking to that you were seeing weeks to months before they were effective or capable of even committing code into a pull request and actually being able to get code moved into a staging or production environment. So how quickly we can get somebody onboarded and ready to go and actually be effective at the job. And then it kind of keeps going. It builds on here from one another. And what's interesting is if you take a look at these teams across the team, so if you looked at 6 different teams, there may be areas for optimization between them. So that's actually what we looked for. It's like seeing if there were specific cross-team pollination areas that would be a great way to leverage the strengths of one team to help another. And if you actually looked at these 2 teams here that are on the screen right now, we looked at, like, for example, that issue identification. You can see that that Fusion team has kind of a low poor score in the issue identification, but then the front end team was scoring well. So we thought about, and if you kind of go down through all the various skills and technical bits that are listed in these stages or units across the various stages, there may be an opportunity for that cross-pollination. There may be an opportunity actually to found guilds internally inside your organization. So if you've got 2 or more software development teams, it would be beneficial if they can leverage the skills from one and another by sharing that knowledge, maybe in a more structured way. For example, hosting tech show and shares on a regular basis with the team, or forming guilds around specific areas, like for example, the backend technologies or data guilds or a DevOps guild, so that one team now can leverage those knowledge and strengths for another. And that helps with that last column, that transform column. You see that the green from the front end team has under team resiliency. Being able to cross-pollinate and cross-train your developers inside of a one group now can help another group, with cross-pollinating that to other software development teams that are out there. So there were lots of issues out there, lots of reasons and things to blame, but there was actually some teams in this group that had strong practices that I don't think their central software development management or CTO was even aware of some of the strengths that were going on under the covers inside these teams. So if you wanted to start down the same journey internally in your own organization, where to start? Obviously, we've talked about interviews and the time that went into doing this kind of an interview. I would recommend not relying on interviews because again, the time involved and you don't get to cover everybody's voice as part of that process, but relying more on surveys. Switching that into a more automated set of surveys that you can actually give to everyone in the team and do on a regular basis. So being able to now be able to invite everyone so every voice can be heard. So not with the interviews, not everyone also who was invited to those in-person interviews spoke their minds. They were sitting in a room with their leadership or their direct managers, and so they may actually be hesitant to really speak their mind if you're doing an interview basis. But if we can build a survey where you can anonymize the results, you may actually get higher quality results back from the team and actually get a truer picture of what's going on inside your development organizations. We want to be able to aggregate those results at a team level, not an individual level, so we can look at the team as a whole and move the needle on the whole team and not look at individual contributors who may, I think it's a lot easier to deal with individual contributors than it would be easier to deal at the team level than it is to have the fault lie on any one person. A big part of this also is to identify those areas of synergy. And that was probably the biggest takeaway we took from that process we went through with the other organization, was that they actually found that there were so many resources already available to them. They didn't need to necessarily go out and hire new people or let go of certain people. There were actually better ways of taking the people who were already part of the team. They had been hired for a reason. They were already into the culture, or they could identify people who were not good fits for the culture and make appropriate changes as needed. So if you think about doing this on your own, let's talk about that real quick. Because you could do DIY assessments. You need to identify, again, your software development lifecycle practices and be able to put those into a survey. Be able to order them by that priority. So if you looked at our stages, the 4 stages with the 19 units all in there, there was definitely a priority, a stack order of importance to those things. And you shouldn't be, again, meddling in the higher end of that order unless you've really got a strong foundation. Now, once you've got the strong foundation, everything then can move forward at a much better basis or much easier clip. We then, in our case for this, we actually took all those interview questions, all that interviewing we did for the, 3 hours per team times 6, so 18 hours of interviews. We extracted all the questions that we asked during that interview process and then tried to distill those down into about 3 questions per unit that could hopefully identify any gaps in the process of the software development cycle for these teams, and then give them a new survey again so we can actually start measuring on an ongoing basis, repeating, for example, every 6 months, trying to see if they are actually moving the needle or if there's a team that's maybe having a potential regression. Now, we do have a download here. If you want to scan that code, you should be able to grab this set of our best. So it's actually, we've turned this set of stages and units into a methodology we're calling BEST. So that is our best practice areas. So you can actually get a kind of a sampling of our thoughts on the software development lifecycle process and what is needed to be successful. There's just going to be an outline and an overview here. I don't have all the questions in there. We're continually evolving these. So you may want to check back in with we have a web page set up where you can actually check in on what we've been doing with the best processes as well. This should give you the ability to move into a more data-driven way of assessing and understanding where your team is and where they can move forward. So given you've also got the ability to see that heat map, those team report heat maps highlight those areas that need attention, you really want to be able to get practical recommendations or understand those synergies across those teams. So we actually, we built a whole portal that goes along with the best assessment tools. You don't need to necessarily use our portal or our tools to use this methodology or to think about improving your software development lifecycle, but it helped us put it together so we could actually analyze our own team and then give this to other teams who wanted to improve their software development lifecycle stance as well. So you can see in here, we've got these radar charts that actually allow us to compare the teams, side by side, more overlaid with one another to understand where we've got those moments where teams have certain strengths and other teams probably could use a little more help. So for example, that stage 3 streamline, if you're looking at those teams down there, you can see the yellow team is excelling at, like, for example, disaster recovery, and many of the other teams probably aren't even aware of the disaster recovery stance that their organization has. And this could be for numerous reasons, and that's when you have to still probably take a human touch to kind of dig into the data and understand why that may be. For example, in this case, that yellow team may be like the central IT team, and so they're very familiar with disaster recovery processes, and other teams just should be aware of them, and maybe they aren't. And so that's an area where, for example, the central IT team should be talking more to the other software development groups about what actually is in place. How are they implementing software or disaster recovery in these kinds of cases? So you basically want to be able to get practical, actionable data that can now move your team in the right direction. All right, I think we're looking pretty good here. I've got some time for questions. So if anybody wanted to put questions up on the Slido, we can do questions there, or I can take them just right here in Teams since we're all hanging out and together.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. I do see one question in the chat, and I've opened up the Q&A if people want to throw the questions in there also. Or certainly feel free to raise your hand, and if you want to come off mute, we can talk, ask directly. But
oh yeah, happy to chat. I love questions. I love discussing or debating even what people believe is good process here. Actually, what I'll do is I'll put up a link. There we go. That's a link to the 6up site where we talk more about the best frameworks. So if you want to dive into each of those metrics and think of, or had questions about them, you can grab them from there.
Thank you so much, Calvin. So I have a couple of questions myself, but I'll start with the one that submitted in the chat. How do you, and I think you touched a little bit on this, but it's a good question. How do you quantitatively determine quality score of a qualitative unit? It's a mouthful. For example, how do you measure culture?
So on the concept of culture, we took questions, for example, around like career advancement, understanding what career advancement opportunities may be available, understanding if there were hesitancy for people to raise issues. So we asked a lot of questions around those areas to understand whether it was easy and safe to ask questions or to raise issues amongst the team. Do I feel like I have a clear career path? Is there a career matrix that is well understood by the members of the team? Trying to think what other ones were specifically about that. So it was basically assigning points. So for each question, we may have 3 different responses, and each of those responses will be assigned like 1, 2, or 3 points. And so it's still, I mean, it's pretty rough, but as you start looking at it on a whole, it really does tell the picture of like what's going on as far as culture. Does the team get together on a regular for even social events? Are there outings? Do you have retreats? Those were all items that were actually part of those questions that we put together in there. And I think just their tendency or desire to interact with each other on even a social basis was important, because we had some teams that had zero social interaction, and you could feel it in the room when we were interviewing them. And then as we did turn those sets of interviews into survey questions that we were asking to groups now in an automated fashion, they still held true. Like you could still feel the results. And as we reviewed them with those managers after we did the survey versions of these, it still feels like we hit the mark.
That's an interesting point you bring up, Calvin, and that, or at least something that's interesting to me, that virtual versus in-person world that we live in, and how you can get a vibe and a feel for the room when you're in person versus virtual or doing it statically via website. Any highlights or notes that you noticed during that process, or that maybe others here are taking away can consider as far as how they're interacting with their teams and doing that?
And to be fair, we also launched this like kind of 2021, 2022. So we were still in pandemic mode for a lot of folks. People are still working from home. There's, obviously there's still a desire for remote, but you're seeing a lot of return to office. So I wouldn't say that the results were based on people who were specifically always in person or in the office, but it was how they managed that, even if there was a work from a remote initiative, or if they were a globally distributed team. Some of these teams were in 3 different countries, not just 3 different states. They were not even in the same country with each other, but they still managed to share knowledge amongst each other, and I think that led to the better culture, even though that they weren't in the same room with each other.
Interesting. But Sheena, look, you raised your hand, so
Sheena, you got a question?
Give you a chance.
Oh yeah, I've got loads of questions. So
loads.
Yeah, so loads always. So on the metric stuff, if you're surveying people once every 6 months or so, then is there a way to combat things like recency bias? Because if I had a great week, and then I might answer the questions in one way. Yeah, so I don't know if you do have any tactics around that to get like a more accurate heartbeat of how things are.
No, I don't. That's a good point around like recency bias. Again, someone could have a good week, someone could have a bad week. It obviously helps when you get more data points. So we are trying to get more of the team engaged in the process and not focus on individual results. So in our case, we don't ever reveal to a manager or to anyone in the organization any one individual's responses. And we also allow for an individual to respond, I don't know. And so I don't know comes up. It may not affect the score, but we may note that out in the results as we're discussing it with the leadership or the management team. So someone could, again, maybe they had a bad week and forgot they do disaster recovery. I don't know. And they could say, I just don't know. I don't know. I don't want to answer. That was also an option available to them. We added later because it became clear that not everyone may know the answers to all these questions as they're going through it, because we're trying to survey the entire group, including front-end designers, front-end engineers, back-end developers, data scientists, QA engineers, the UX person, the project manager. How familiar is the project manager with some of these terms? They don't have to say they know how to do Kubernetes and orchestration. They have to say, yeah, I know our team's doing it. I've heard those words, or we're familiar with that, for example.
Cool. Another question about metrics. So like something I've seen happen a lot is that people look at metrics, and like the metric is like the tip of the iceberg, represents so much happening on the surface, and then people focus on that tip and they try to move it around instead of necessarily focusing on the rest of the iceberg. So like a really obvious example would be saying, like, if we're focusing on making sure the code review happens quickly, then people might do that and then do shallow code reviews and really rush through them. So are there ways to like, do you offer any kind of coaching on like how to look at a metric and then think about its root cause? Like, I've seen some very, very clever people try to push metrics around in weird ways. So I think coaching is useful.
Many data points to be considered, like 90 different points that we're looking at. And what we tell the people who are going through the process and taking the surveys is we really want to focus on just the most high burning, like super red issue that's on those heat maps. For example, if something is okay, we're not even going to touch it yet in this iteration. Like we want to look for the low-hanging fruit that is probably obvious to people who are down in the trenches doing the work, but maybe not to the people who are managing the work and the team and the flow. And so instead of like trying to boil the ocean, like let's look specifically, like actually let's look at a specific metric, like for example, security. What are our security practices like? I see we scored poorly because maybe we have poor password hygiene or poor secret sharing going on in the organization. And then from there we ask deeper questions. So the surveys are obviously a jumping off starting point. When we have these discussions, we always want to go right now we always go over them with the end leadership teams so that they can be like, we think that's because of X, Y, and Z, and then we'll have a conversation still about it. I don't think I'd be comfortable yet just letting someone go off the raw data without some analysis coming from us as a group. Actually, when you use the software tool and you log in, it will give you recommendations. So as the leadership can log in, they can see for if they're a director of a software team, they can see their team and their heat map. If they're a point of contact for the group, they can see all the teams and compare them. But when you click into any one of those 19 units that are on the software survey, we actually wrote up recommendations. If you're doing well, it'll say like, keep doing that. And if you're doing poorly, it'll be like, you might want to consider, and here's some things to consider. So there's some automated bits that are in there that you can use, but I wouldn't rely on that only. I still would want to have those conversations as we go over the results of the data. So that way it's less likely for someone to kind of push a metric, a specific way or distort the potential results without having that conversation. And then we typically write up those results afterward.
Okay, that's really nice. Yeah, I think that sounds very powerful. I have another unrelated to metrics question. Does anybody else want to ask a question?
We've got
Anybody else have questions?
Sheena, I'll put you on a pause. How about that? We've got one question in the Q&A just to mix it up a bit, and then we'll get back to you if nobody else has any others. But I'll add to this question in the chat. When learning what's happening within the organization, when are surveys the right way to go, and when are interviews the right way to go? And I would add to that in respects to also considering when's the right time to be doing this. I think you mentioned earlier is better, of course, but just curious when you talk about surveys versus interviews, and which one to go with or which one not to go with.
Yeah. I mean, the interviews were a great way for us to understand there was a need to solve this kind of a problem, or to uncover these kinds of issues, to understand what the maturity level for a team was. But we knew we weren't getting the whole picture because of people's biases, talking in the same room with other people. We weren't doing one-on-one interviews. We were doing interviews with a group of people. So you were getting some, potentially skewed information that way. I like the idea of the surveys and making sure the surveys are non-identifiable to the individual contributors so that they feel more confident that they can express their true feelings and true opinion about it. And hopefully they do, maybe they are a little harsh, but if they aren't harsh, then you're living in kind of a false reality of what your software development world really is. So I think the surveys are definitely the way to go. I think the discussion afterwards about the results as an aggregate, again, we're never trying to point any one person out. It's typically not a single person's fault that they're having a poorly performing team. It's always a combination of factors that are always at play. And it's just we're all humans. We can't help it. That's what we do. But if we can build on the strengths that are in each of those teams, and if we can identify them by these surveys, I feel like we've got a really a powerful combination of tools that actually gets us it's funny. Sheena will recognize this from the Django community, the 10x developer talk that Jacob Kaplan-Moss gave in Montreal. There's this idea that there's a 10x developer out there, a superhero who can save the day. It doesn't exist. You'd really prefer to have a team that can operate at a level that produces that multiplier as a team, as opposed to a solo superhero. So that's what I say to that. The interviews, I mean, they're hard. They're much harder. They're much more consuming, and probably less accurate. You're going to get more feelings back from an interview, but I think we're trying to look at data and trying to see if there's a way we can extract some useful data here. Hopefully that answered your question.
Ashina, I'll give you a chance to ask your other question.
It's a DjangoCon related question. So I'm wondering how you would apply this framework or parts of it to a team of open source contributors. I'm asking it because DjangoCon Africa we're starting to plan it out, and there's a bunch of volunteers who are there to help with the website and the CFP process and things like that. And how do you wrangle like it's chaos? Well, it's not chaos. It's not like bad chaos, but you know, it is a bit chaos.
Yeah. Well, the beauty of open source is you don't have to apply and get accepted. You typically just step up and volunteer.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a different. I feel like it'd be a different approach. Like with working for an organization and being a member of a software development team, they're trying to piece together skills that they feel like superpowers whatever mission they have. With the open source communities, you want to open the door so that as many people as possible can contribute in some way, and hopefully they contribute in a way that is in line with their superpowers. So the first step is going to be helping people. And this is where probably individuals is more important in open source than it is in like a software development team in a company. It's helping people understand actually what their unique abilities are. If they don't know what their abilities actually are, they're going to be contributing at a lower effectiveness level than if you actually help guide them through understanding themselves better as a human being. This is actually something we do at 6 Feet Up when we hire folks. Is we actually like to understand as a human being, what makes you tick? Like, what's your behavioral and personality traits that we think are going to dovetail well into the type of a role we may be put into. And I don't think a lot of people have done this kind of activity. I mean, people have done Myers-Briggs and the DISC and things like that. And so we've used these kinds of tools for hiring. And we don't necessarily base the sole hiring or firing on a score they would have gotten, but it helps us like that multiplier out of a single person as they join the team and can feel productive. And I think I wish you had the capability, or maybe some open source groups should leverage these behavioral tools and help people on their like life journey, because obviously they're engaged, they're excited, they want to be a part of a community, part of a tribe. So you're dealing with a person more, I think, on an open source community than you are in a software development team where you're dealing with an aggregate of people together. So if we can get like the DjangoCon organizers to like understand them, get in touch with themselves better, I can only imagine it would be for the best for the whole team, the whole community. That's a good question. That's an interesting question because it is different, I feel like.
Yeah, it is different. I think there is overlap. So things around, source control management and training and growth mindset and things like that are like the same, but you implement them differently. And then you get your volunteers, but how do you set them up for success in different ways? So that's interesting.
Yeah, I think as an individual manager, you are interested in setting up your developers, your individual contributors for success, and so the growth mindset. That's why we use those tools internally, because we are trying to make sure that we're not putting somebody in a spot where they're just going to fail because that's just not who they are. It's not how they want to. That's not how they operate, like their MO.
Hey, Calvin, I've got a question.
Awesome.
Thank you, Sheena, for those are great questions. And hopefully it's inspiring a few other folks or giving some other people some things to think through. And if you've got questions, again, we've got a few minutes here still to throw into the Q&A if you'd like. Calvin, I guess my question that's rattling in my head as it relates to this, and maybe there's applicability outside of if you're managing your own software development team. So if some of the audience may be, early stage founders and a small team of 2 or 3, and they may be coding or developing on their own versus some that may be also considering or are already engaged with an outsourced development shop.
Mm-hmm.
How, I know that gets a little tricky, so I don't want to, paint you in a corner to answer the question. I know it can be tricky as far as who you're interacting with, if it's a contractual basis, whether it's a 1099 individual or a firm that you're contracting with. Is there ways to infuse this or to have them do this, because then you're doing some of this early work before they even do any work in some ways? Just kind of curious, from an earlier stage or a smaller team's perspective, how can you weave that into the agreements or into the interactions?
Yeah, I would love it if every company we interacted with, we could give them the same assessment tools that we put our own people through, because then you're gonna gain a boost in empathy when dealing and talking to those people. I think is actually the biggest gain you get right away. When I first moved back to Indiana from San Francisco, my wife and I, who's my co-founder, went through a leadership program here in Indiana, and one of the units was on DISC, and we both had never done DISC before. We did the DISC test, and I think it has saved parts of our marriage, because you look at the results, excuse me, and you read back to each other what the report says, and some of it's pretty generic, but sometimes it hits on a vein, and you're like, oh my God, that's why you are the way you are, like, or that's why I think about when I have the feelings I have when I see certain things happen. And I think I get the same impression sometimes when I talk to some clients, like some people who we're interacting with, or an organization. And I think that the organization should be flipped around. They should be motivated to ask all of their agencies or offshore resources or outsourced resources to do the similar kind of thing, to see if there's even a good fit and a good way to work to be more empathetic to each other. I think empathy goes a long way in software development and understanding as humans. It's obviously not just about software development. It's about how do we all move together forward as a kind of a bigger picture. And I think sometimes you just get into the minutia of a ticket or an issue or a bug, and it doesn't matter if you're engaging a software agency who's going to be doing the biggest AI project you've ever seen, or if you're engaging with an offshore agency that's just there to do back office manual tasks. There's still people behind all those processes, and I think you can get more performance out of all the people involved if they have a better understanding of each other.
Awesome. And I'm going to have my wife take the disc tonight. So
You should.
we're going to see if
Another one we've done recently is the well, not recently, actually, it's probably been 10 years now, is the Kolbe, Kolbe assessment. And that's an interesting one because there's no right or wrong answers in these assessment tools. Like, there's people who are higher performing at one thing, and maybe it takes more energy for them to do the same thing another person would take less energy to do. And so that's been an interesting one where we've had comparisons, where we do a lot of like talking back and forth about I'm not going to do these kinds of tasks anymore because you actually probably enjoy it, and you would get energy and excitement out of doing that kind of a task, and so there's no reason I should toil over it anymore. And having those negotiations even at the married couple level has been very, very helpful.
I'm sure it has. Yeah, 5 love languages. Maybe we should use that in software development. Yeah. Flip it, right? Great. Thank you so much for everybody participating with the Q&A and asking some good questions. I'll make a round last call here. I don't see any others popping in yet, but if you've got a question, feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, throw it in the chat if you want to not speak verbally. Yep. But
or you can find me at any of these places online. All the social addresses I just threw up there. I'm not a hard person to track down and find.
Yeah,
and generally I'd say I'm pretty friendly.
Generally, it's been my experience as well.
Yeah.
Calvin, so. Yeah, if I'll throw in also just a link to the Purdue Innovates site for anybody that isn't familiar or hasn't been online or understands. If you have Purdue connectivity, if you are an alumnus, if you are a student, if you're faculty, or if you are licensing intellectual property from the university, that gives you a Purdue connection. And we are here as the incubator and our tech transfer team and our ventures team to provide a level of support non-academically associated with Purdue and with Boilermakers across the globe.